Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining my talk today about onboarding engineers onto your team. It's too bad that we don't get to see each other in person, but I'm really glad that I get to share this with a broader audience, especially because a lot has changed in the world between the time that I submitted this talk and now, and I think it's impossible to ignore that reality. Some people are going to be starting new jobs remotely, and that's adding a layer of complexity onto something that is already pretty difficult. So, I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about different approaches for remote onboarding throughout this talk to address some of the nuances and to help everyone provide the best experience that they can right now. I've been working as an engineer for nearly the last decade, and I've been at Fellow for the last year and a half, where I'm currently on the engineering team in Ottawa, Canada. I've spent a lot of time putting together onboarding processes and helping engineers get set up on new teams. I created the onboarding process at Fellow, and before that, I was at SurveyMonkey, where I taught some of the classes that newly hired engineers went through, and I was a coordinator for the internship program, where I had to help teams get set up for their students and bring a lot of people onto the team. This is something that I have a lot of experience with and have been collecting feedback on for years, and it's a topic that I find pretty important. I think that one of the most important skills you can have as an engineer, and especially as a manager, is empathy. Whether it's empathy for the people using your product, the people interacting with your team, or the people that need to go through the processes you've set up. On your team, part of that empathy is towards people who are perhaps nervously joining and have no context on what tools you use, what process you have, and what your tech stack looks like. Something that might seem obvious to you might not even be something that new hires think of asking about, and it makes it harder to get up to speed as fast as we'd like, and might make the people feel like they're not doing such a great job or aren't smart enough. I'm going to show you how to avoid this situation so that your new teammates can get up to speed quickly and you can create a great culture on your team. I think that the reason I feel a particular empathy for people starting a new job is because of how absolutely lost I felt when I started my first programming job. When I was really young, I was lucky enough to get an internship over the summer before university at a local startup. And I mean, super lucky. I knew how to program, but basically only in Visual Basic. I never heard of the web or programming with like Python or HTML or JavaScript. I didn't even know that you could have web apps as a business because this was back when you download most software that you wanted to use. So, long story short, I spent weeks Googling things like what is an API, what is a webhook, what is request, what is a server, and how do you log into server, getting progressively more and more detailed because I had no idea what was going on. I didn't know who to ask. I felt like it was assumed that I was supposed to have all the answers. Because there was no onboarding process, I felt a little bit lost, and that has always stuck with me. It was also a great learning experience. I think that I learned the most that summer out of all of them. But this kind of experience isn't scalable when you're trying to onboard 5, 10, or 50 engineers into your company. Since then, I've helped onboard a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and I've screwed up in the process a lot too. The first time I onboarded someone was when I was still an intern returning for the summer, and a brand new intern was brought on board. I was supposed to hand off the project I'd built to him, and I basically just sat him down for a day and did a line by line walkthrough of the entire code base to tell him everything that I knew and thought that that would be the end of it. That kind of information isn't useful without the context around business requirements, the why of the product, and knowing the people who are using it. And no one's going to remember the details of thousands of lines of code, and no one is going to care. By overloading him with information, nothing was remembered, and I got a lot of questions over the next few months, which could have been avoided if I'd focused on a strategy that set him up to be able to figure out answers for himself. At my last job, the engineering organization had this onboarding process where new hires had to go through a series of courses in their first 2 weeks to get up to speed on different technologies that we used. I taught the Intro to Jinja course, which is a templating system used with Django. But we had so many different products and teams in the company that only a handful of the new hires would ever use Jinja. So a lot of people would skip out on the sessions or not find the content relevant. And these courses would be taught to junior developers and senior developers and just about everyone. And a lot of it was just going over things that you could look up easily in the documentation. Everyone would leave these kinds of sessions feeling like they'd wasted time, and I eventually felt defeated and like I wasn't teaching anything cool or useful, so I stepped down as the instructor. And while you might not want to set up courses or some large structure to teach everyone everything you might think they need to know, It's equally important to not skip over anything that might seem obvious to you and assume that the new person knows everything. This is true for technical things, like maybe someone is an incredible Python programmer but just has never gotten around to trying Kubernetes, and so they need a quick intro or at least a heads up that's something that they should be looking into. It's also relevant for organizational and interpersonal things too. Like, it's important to be wary of people's backgrounds. Maybe someone on your team has worked at a tech company and knows what a scrum is and is on board with agile and waterfall and all those process things, but a new hire could be joining from an agency where they didn't have those kinds of structures, and they might be kind of lost if you don't take the time to walk through how you get work done on your team. A while ago, I was onboarding someone, and partway through the high level code base overview, they stopped me because they hadn't even seen the product live before. They didn't know the overall structure of the company, and they incorrectly thought that I was their manager. I made this assumption that people had a baseline understanding of what was going on, and I was wrong pretty often. It can feel awkward for people to ask what seem like basic questions when they're still new, because by your confidence, it can seem like they should know the answers already, and they might be afraid to bring it up. It's important to go into onboarding assuming that the person has the skills and the abilities to perform the job they were hired to do, but has none of the context yet. Plus, reiteration of some of the things they might already know doesn't hurt at this stage because repetition and reinforcement is key when there's so much new stuff to learn. Eventually, after making a lot more mistakes with a lot more people, I narrowed down a framework for onboarding that we now use at Fellow, and probably about half the company has been through. No matter what process you come up with, one of the most important steps is to ask for feedback so that you can figure out what parts need improving, which parts are not helpful, and what is valuable that needs to stick around. I send out the same feedback survey to every new hire at the end of their first week on the job so that I can get a good idea of what needs to change. And it's brought a lot of great insights, and it's shaped our process for the better. And this framework is what I would like to share with you today so that you too can create your own onboarding process to get engineers on your team up to speed quickly and effectively. Before we get started, it's important to frame everything you do and every process that you set up through the eyes of the new hire, and you'll need an abundance of empathy. Think back to when you first started, all the questions you had and the difficulties you encountered. Remember that when they start, they likely won't know anyone or any of the process or tradition, and will feel a little out of place when they try to get up to speed. And at this time, it's especially important to have an even deeper sense of empathy. Whether or not they were hired to work remotely, the current situation is not normal remote work. If they were hired expecting to come into an office, they might not have a proper office setup at home, or they might just not have fast internet, they might be looking after kids, or just overall not have the ideal work from home setup. Whatever their situation, it's important to be patient and understanding, and to often be reassuring them that you're there for them and that you too understand that this won't be a totally normal work environment for a while. The most important part of onboarding is setting up the right relationships early on. By making these connections early, it will be easier for the person to open a line of communication with others, to ask any questions that they'll need answers to. And it can be awkward coming in somewhere and not knowing who is in charge of what, or who to ask certain things from, or not knowing whether people even realize you exist. Some of the most important interactions that you can start setting up are your one-on-ones. Make sure that you set up your first one-on-one with your new direct report early on, and keep it going on a regular cycle so that they know they have a time and space to talk to you about their career goals, their ideas, concerns, and whatever else they might have to say. This is a great time for you to get a good pulse check on how they're doing and talk about things that they might not want to bring up in team meetings. Introducing them to team members is important and sometimes forgotten. Make your team aware in advance that someone is joining and let them know to welcome them. Make sure to introduce them to the people on the other teams they'll be working with too. As an engineer, you might be working with designers or product people or sales or what have you. Having these lines of communication open early on can make collaboration easier later when it comes time for projects. And lastly, set them up with a buddy. It'll be easier for them to ask questions if they know that they have a dedicated person to go to who is expecting to be overloaded with questions for the first little while. While you're working remotely, this step is especially important and has to be done in a very deliberate way since the hallway talk and the chance of running into someone by the coffee machine and being able to introduce yourself is so much lower. A good practice is to use a Slack message or an email to have the new hire introduce themselves to their team or company. Slack, I find, is better because then everyone can interact with the message and put little emojis, and it makes you feel very at home and very happy right away. You don't get that interaction with email. Setting them up with a buddy here is very important because when you can't visibly see whether or not someone is getting annoyed with your questions, you're going to be less likely to ask them. And this is a point in time where it's critical to ask as many questions as possible. If they're set up with a dedicated question answerer, they won't feel bad about it. Instead of sending emails to intro them to the people they'll be working with, set up individual video calls so that they can get a feel of how the person communicates. Getting an indication for things like sarcasm level and speech can be vital information and avoid a lot of awkward mix-ups. Don't schedule them all back to back though. Video call fatigue is very real, and if your new hire is an introvert, this will be an exhausting step of an already stressful process for them. There is a lot of knowledge that your team has, which is just known stuff that any outsider would not be able to figure out for themselves without asking. And your team absolutely has this, and it is creating a bottleneck. Figure out what it is and write it down. If there's ever any issue that someone on the team encounters and someone says, "Oh yeah, that happened to me last week and I did whatever to solve it," write that down. If there's an announcement at a team meeting about a new way of doing things or a new linter to install or whatever, write that down. And this doesn't have to look like the type of documentation you'd expect from a third-party library or API, but it should cover the things that are super specific to your team. And it won't just help out your new hires, it'll end up paying off for the people within the team too. I've gone back on our own dev docs plenty of times to remember how to run certain tests or set up an environment just right. Actively encourage everyone on the team to contribute to this documentation. It should be a collaborative effort and represent the thinking of everyone. And you can set up this knowledge base in any online collaboration tool. We host an internal docs site built on the Read the Docs Sphinx theme because it's nice and familiar to us Python devs. Similar to your code-based documentation, you should create a team and company FAQ. There are a lot of non-code things that are just known within the team too, like how to properly create a pull request, how to request time off, what Jira process you should follow, and how to hand off tickets to QA, where the Wi-Fi info is stored, or even what dev meeting etiquette is and whether or not you need to prepare anything. There's a lot, and while it can be figured out over time, it can reduce stress by having answers to some of those questions up front. This is also something that everyone on your team can contribute to, and it should be something that new hires add questions to while they're discovering that they wish they knew something. Both this FAQ and the code-based documentation are especially helpful for people working remotely where they don't have the in-person context available or won't have people around that they can just quickly ask. It can help people feel more confident going into a situation or point them towards other questions that they should be asking. One of the biggest stress-inducing parts of joining a new team is not knowing what you're expected to accomplish and by when. It's common to see people going overboard trying to do as much as they possibly can in the shortest amount of time, or working overtime in the first few months while pretending that they aren't, just to make it seem like they have it all together. It can feel like you're supposed to be as good as the existing team members when you join, and that's impossible to achieve because you aren't used to the code base yet and you don't have all this institutional knowledge that they've acquired over maybe years. To combat that, set out a realistic timeline for different goals for them to accomplish. For example, break down the dev setup process into small chunks like getting localhost running, getting third-party integrations hooked up, getting tests passing, or whatever, which might span a day. Then set out a goal for completing a particular ticket, creating a pull request, or whatever little units of work that you can do in 1 week on your team. These should be easily accomplishable so that the new hire feels like they're on track when they check each one off. Then set up goals for them to track their progress throughout the next 3 months. They should have a clear understanding of what knowledge they're expected to have and what pace they should be working at that point. By defining exactly what you're looking for, they won't burn themselves out and will know how to plan out their work to meet the goals. It gives them something to work towards, and if they surpass expectations, then they'll get a chance to be pleased with themselves, and getting that boosts their productivity in return. Celebrate the goals and milestones that they achieve on a team Slack channel. It's not easy for them to swivel their chair around and happily announce to their desk neighbor that they've created their first pull request. So look out for those moments and call them out so that the team can celebrate with them. Even when I was in the office in person, one of the ways that I felt extremely welcome to the team was when my manager commented on my first pull request saying that I did a great job and congratulations. This might seem obvious, but it's actually sometimes forgotten. Make sure that you have a computer and any required hardware for people well in advance of their anticipated start date. It might be a bit tough to join a team as a programmer when you don't have a laptop or a keyboard, or if you haven't even been allocated a desk yet and people scramble to clean off the desk that was being used as storage for you. When people are working remotely, you'll have to take this a step further and figure out how to get hardware to the person's home. Make sure that you take into account any installation that IT might have to do before getting them the laptop. Although if you have IT, you might be in a large enough company that you don't have to worry about the process of getting them a laptop. People who are working from home right now might not have been expecting to, and their homes might not be set up with a proper office space. Try to figure out whether your company can allocate a budget to outfit their home office, or if there's any equipment that can be loaned to them. Having a desk, chair, and a monitor can make a huge difference compared to sitting on the couch looking down at a laptop for weeks, and it will make them a lot more productive. I did this for a few months in university, and I had to get physio to fix my back. It's also good to make sure that they have fast, unlimited internet. Otherwise, doing things like having video calls or installing software might be a cause for concern for them. Asking for feedback is something that doesn't come naturally, especially if it's about you or something you've made and you're proud of. But it's a crucial step in the process because if you don't, you might be missing out on key insights about things that aren't working. I have a feedback survey that I send to every new engineer after their first week on their team, which I send within Fellow's feedback feature. I ask them some star rating questions so I can track metrics over time, but also a lot of open-ended questions about what worked really well and what didn't, and I ask for ideas on what they do to make their first week easier if they could go over it again. It's played a big part in how we've shaped the process, and every piece of feedback we get makes it even easier for the next person joining the team. We also make it easy for people to contribute their feedback directly into the process. The frequently asked questions section and team documentation are editable by anyone, and they're encouraged to correct anything that's no longer valid and make pull requests to make sure that we're keeping all of our information up to date. These little contributions help them feel like they're more a part of the team too. So that's a lot of tips and steps, but it might be hard to visualize this as an actual process that translates into something that you can run your new hires through. So I'm going to show you a bit of how we've put this together at Fellow. This is an example template of a note that we use for people joining the team. This gets created and attached to the all-day event that everyone has in their calendar, marking the first day of the new hire, and it's divided up into different sections that cover each of the steps that I outlined. On this note, you'll find a list of helpful resources, your teammate names, and then also a whole bunch of little different digestible goals. So we have 2 engineering sections at the bottom, and these are to break down the installation process and the Jira process into little checkable formats so that you can feel like you're accomplishing something. Managers have access to this note too, so they can easily see how the new hire is progressing throughout their first day or few days without having to ask them constantly how they're doing and whether or not they're stuck, because they can easily see it from here. Outside of this note, we also set up a lot of different things like one-on-ones with managers, team lunches, sales demo tag-alongs, and different meetings like that, because relationships really are the most important part of onboarding. With these 6 steps as a baseline, relationships, knowledge, FAQ, goals, space, and feedback, you'll be well on your way to creating a repeatable onboarding process for your team. These are really the bare bones that you need in order to level the playing field and make sure that everyone joining gets an equal footing in their first few weeks. This is a process that you never want to leave up to chance. And while some of those steps might seem like things to tackle later on when you have your next hire, there are some things that you can start doing today to get ready for that day. Whether you're a manager, a team lead, or an engineer, you can start by creating a set of documentation for your code base. You can also create a team FAQ for non-code things, like which meetings are actually meetings and what you don't have to go to. For example, we have a weekly Friday meeting booked on our calendars to use as note space to write out what we shipped over the week, and we don't actually physically meet. And this confused new hires for a long time because we weren't writing it down. And so when we were in the office, it was understood because people would see that we weren't all of a sudden standing up to go to a meeting. But when we're working remotely, that context is not there. And lastly, you can ask your team for feedback. Whether or not you had some kind of official process, everyone on your team started at some point, and they probably have some thoughts on what could have made the process easier. Ask them or send out a survey and use that as a base point to evaluate how you should be setting this up. This process will take some time to build up from scratch, and you want to start basic before ramping up to anything too complex. Eventually, you can start experimenting with things like classes, official meet and greet sessions, and what have you. But remember, there is such a thing as too much process. If you have a company with 10 people, you probably don't need to have a week-long process with classes and instructors and a ton of structure. Start small and build up as needed. You will still want to give people some flexibility in how they start out in their new job. I hope that this talk has sparked some ideas for how you can set up or improve your own team's onboarding process. I'd love to hear about any unique ways you're onboarding people, or if you have any success in what I've talked about today. You can get in touch with me through my Twitter handle, AlexandraS_dev. Thank you, and I hope to see you all at next year's PyCon.